Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Liz Pimper, and I'll be your moderator for today's WJE webinar, Masonry Facade Repair, Developing an Approach for Success. During the next hour, WJE experts Matt Novesky and Rachel will discuss effective methodologies for assessment and repair of masonry facades. Through project case studies, the presenters will demonstrate best practices for a successful approach to masonry repair, emphasizing the implementation of a project methodology that establishes general parameters for the project in the investigation and design phases that are then refined during construction. This presentation is copyrighted by Janney Elstner Associates. And now I will turn it over to Matt to get us started. Matt?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Liz, and thank you for everybody who's joining us this afternoon. Learning objective today, as you can see on the screen, we're hoping by the end of this discussion, you will be able to identify the masonry steps for facade assessments and why those are important or why they are performed by an AE. Identify or have some idea of some of the typical distress that masonry facades can have or experience. Assess an effective way and different way to strategize to perform different masonry facade repairs, and be able to summarize why a successful plan for implementing a repair with AE, the owner, and the contractor is important to get a successful project done. As you can see here, what we're briefly going to do is an introduction first of why AEs might get involved in a building, talk about some of the typical assessment investigation protocols that the AE does, identify typical masonry distress that might be found on buildings so that owners have an idea of what is occurring, and then go into facade approaches for repairs. And this will get us into 3 case studies that will talk about kind of the same approach, but how it differs between each project based upon the owner's needs, the facade materials, and the end-all goal of the project. Now, the case studies in today's lessons are all about big, large rehabs of buildings, but this approach can be used for any size project or building material. The first slide kind of gives you an overall of masonry facades and how they transition through the years. The orange box highlights buildings that we see a high majority of work on this now currently, based upon the years of age and how old they are. But the buildings talked today are going to be mainly the 1920s, 1930s building types. So the first question is, why does an AE get involved? Why would an owner contact an AE firm to look at the building? And there's a big range of things that might happen. One might be as easy as facade ordinances. Many of the large cities have an ordinance, so the owner needs to check a box every couple of years in order to have it fulfilled with the city and make sure that the building is staying up to par and up to shape. Other reasons might be condition assessments. Somebody wants to buy a building, pre-condition assessment. They want to get an idea of what a facade might cost, how much money they might have to put into it when they buy it. Due diligence and reserve studies. They have buildings they want to maintain. They haven't done work in 20, 30 years. They want to know kind of what they need to do and prioritize work, as well as get an idea of cost. Or simply maybe it's as simply as having a maintenance plan going forward, because building owners want to have budget money so that they can keep up on their facades and not have any surprises come in as they maintain and own the buildings. And there are things more immediate needs are water leakage, air leakage, having a structural or a falling hazard issue, and hopefully an AE gets called before something catastrophic occurs. Or again, adaptive reuse. You're buying a building and you want to change it into something else, so you want to kind of do a holistic repair around the building. Types of investigations, condition assessments that AE firms will do. A whole list here. Not all of these are used all the time. It depends, again, on what the goal is for the project, the client, the architect, contractors. But to go over a few of these, you typically jump into document review, original drawings, anything the owner can give to us that helps us know previous maintenance of the building, how the building is constructed or is meant to be constructed. Detailing always helps. Then we perform an assessment of the building, and it gets right into documentation. looking at the building either from grade for some of them. Facade ordinances a lot of times are just performed from grade with binoculars. Or you can get up and do close-up inspections. The number of drops, how much of the building you cover, again, depends upon what the owner wants to know, how much they want to know it, and what the end-all goal of the project is. May create inspection openings to find out detailing cause of distress. This will more likely get you into the construction documents. And if need be, perform testing, whether in situ or in laboratory, in order to find out what's causing the problem and help design a suitable repair, which then moves you into trial mock-ups and trial repairs. Briefly, some things, again, if you get on the building, some things you might do some field testing. Again, this more gets you in line with developing documents, sounding things, sounding distresses to find out what is occurring, why it's occurring. And there's a whole list of things that AE firms can do in the field to determine what the distress is, how the building might be constructed, and help problem solve the issues. If need be, sometimes materials need to be removed and taken to the laboratory because it's more of a material issue that's causing the distress or the failure rather than a construction or a structural issue. And this slide just kind of lists a couple types of testing that can be done in a laboratory in order for these types of materials. Won't go through it, but here is listed for mortar, stone, and this slide is for brick and terracotta. So a bunch of material testing that can be done to see what the cause is of the type of distress. Now I will turn over to Rachel, who will get into the masonry deterioration and distress.
Thanks, Matt. So understanding the source of distress is very important in developing an appropriate repair for masonry facades. So oftentimes there's sort of overall sources of deterioration, whether those be moisture or building movement. Sometimes it's related to the materials themselves, the properties. Sometimes it's related to the AE, whether it's design of repairs or original design, and sometimes it's related to the contractor, the workmanship. So whether that's for repairs or actual original install. So with that, we're going to look at some typical types of masonry distress and deterioration. These really start with the most minor, that being joint deterioration, moving to the most severe, ultimate failure. And these can exist in many forms on any type of masonry facade, whether it's brick, terracotta, stone, and they oftentimes exist together. So with that being said, joint deterioration, the joints between the masonry units, sometimes we have visible cracking, sometimes this is something you can see. Grade, sometimes it's something you need to get up close to. Sometimes we have in-plane cracks, which is determined through that field testing, whether it's sounding or some of the other elements that Matt talked about. Sometimes there's spalling, oftentimes displacements, where these could have occurred over time or relative to original install, and often a loss of lateral anchorage. So moving into the masonry facade repair approach that we want to discuss today. A little bit of background relative to the two sort of approaches that exist in construction are really helpful to understand where this masonry facade repair approach fits in. So looking at the top here, we have a traditional design, bid, build construction process, which is used very, very typically throughout many construction projects, not just being facade projects or not just being masonry projects as well. And then at the bottom, we have the design, build, or design repair construction process. And these really sort of diverge when it comes to when construction happens and what happens in that early phase, whether it's just the definition of the project, how much is really gotten into in terms of contract documents and bidding. And as you'll see through the case studies that we talk about a little bit later, all of them take a slightly different approach somewhere in between these two approaches listed here. So the masonry facade repair approach that we're going to highlight today really has some typical steps, meaning that it starts with that initial condition assessment and investigation that Matt highlighted. There's oftentimes a development of a prioritized repair scope. What are the things that need to be done now? What are things that can be done in 5 years? Maybe things that can be done in 10 years. With that, there's oftentimes wanting to know how much is it going to cost? What are the estimate of probable costs for those recommended repairs? Sometimes we move into a scope document phase and really just defining sort of the overall goals of the project and what is understood at the time of the investigation. And really one of the incredibly important steps in this approach is the construction observation, which oftentimes has some stabilization and additional material removal happening, really understanding what are the concealed conditions, what can we not see until we get up and start to take the building apart. Oftentimes this results in development of supplemental repair details, and then ultimately final inspections and project closeout. So why use this approach? As Matt said, the case studies that we have today are for large-scale adaptive reuse projects, but it can be used on really any masonry facade repair project. And we think that it's a successful approach because it's a collaborative approach. It involves all stakeholders, the owner, the architect engineer, and the masonry contractor, using shared documentation and the ability to communicate field observations very quickly to the entire team. It typically saves time. It allows for the reallocation of budget for repairs based on the actual findings when we get up close to the facade and understand what's actually going on. It can provide for appropriate repairs because we're reacting to those field conditions and really understanding the source of deterioration and distress. But it requires a timely response from everyone on the team. And it also requires an understanding of the masonry facade system and the mechanisms of deterioration. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk about our first case study, and we will highlight 3 throughout this process.
Thank you, Rachel. The first case study here is in 1925. It was a brick terracotta building that had a fairly large addition put on in the 30s that occupies 2 city blocks. So as you can imagine, the sheer size and quantity of the facade was pretty enormous. The client here was purchasing the building and going to repurpose it. So the timeline of AE's involvement on this project was we gave a cost estimate, just a magnitude, again, walking around the building from grade, give the client a magnitude of how much we thought repair project might cost. And this is based just upon experience, type of facade material, types of distress observed. Based upon that, owner asked us to get numbers from contractors, and rather than bidding out each and every typical detail, we thought, based upon the material and type of distress we were seeing, it was best to get unit prices. And I'll go into that a little bit more in the slides and show you how that was done. And then that was a quick turnaround for the beginning kind of investigation, document pricing, get a contractor on board, and it moved into a facade rehabilitation project that took 4 years to complete. And all of this was a fast-paced project in order to get the client into the building, so obviously they can make revenue, as well as fulfill needs for the local government as far as repairs that they wanted to see and timeline that they wanted things completed in. Here, going back to our chart, is kind of a quick summary of the project. As you can see, the cost estimate scope doc was a fairly small, quick process done all within a year, even a couple months of time, and it quickly moved into a construction project. And again, we'll kind of go through the processes as we go through this case study. But moving right into the project definition. From grade, looking, the AE can go walk around the building, look at where they're destroying, if there's symptomatic, typical locations that it's occurring, if there's a one-off condition, again, what is the stress in the material and what might be causing it, so you can get an idea of the type of repair to summarize and get costs for a competitive bid across contractors. Again, where is the distress? In the material itself? Is it at shelf angles? Is it near structural supports? Is it within the field of the wall? And here on this project, again, had a bunch of different materials, limestone, brick, terracotta, getting a sense of how widespread that distress might be. Always helps if you can get up close. In this project, it wasn't possible for the initial cost estimate, and that didn't happen until we started to refine things in the construction process. But what we were able to do is get in and get a unit cost. Again, limestone building, the majority of the building was limestone. saw that the majority of the stress was occurring at shelf angles, so kind of a typical location. Able, based upon experience, knowledge, a little bit of documentation of how the building was constructed, to come up with a repair design. And this sheet is one of a couple. Kind of gives a typical idea of how the intent of a limestone repair. Gives the size of the unit, but not only that, gives a number of anchors and things to do to the structural support in the backup, clean and paint steel, things like that. So the contractor could actually give a unit cost to replace limestone, and it didn't matter on the size of the unit. We got a unit cost for a cubic foot, which included anchors. So if the size varied, it didn't matter. It was the same number of anchors, but quantity could be based upon an actual size of a unit. And you didn't have 20, 30 different line items for various modifications of the limestone. So it helped with getting an actual cost together at the end and throughout the project, made it simplified it. Then we moved into documentation, and documentation is throughout this process. From here on out, there was always documentation and updating of it. Back in the day, everything used to be done by hand and paper and faxed over people. Things took quite some time. Nowadays, AE firms use different types of programs. A lot of the time, it's digital. It can be something that can be processed right away and sent over to the team in order for them to view and see what's going on. It's also something that can be uploaded to FTP sites and shared, again, so that the owner, the contractor, and the AE firm are all on the same page. And the initial documentation, as you can see here, was kind of going up, identifying where repairs are, shooting it right off to the contractor. They could get back on the swing stage and start demo the same day. So again, kind of speeding up the construction process. Then once that starts, once you start getting on the initial part of the building, it's very important for the AE firm to get in there and do some supplemental investigation and detailing. Are the details that you showed in your unit cost or anything like that, are you running into the same conditions? Does anything have to be modified? Do you have to get right on board with the contractor and say, hey, we showed this, but we want it modified for you to do X, Y, and Z? So that, again, construction can move, the team is on the same page, you keep it going. At the same time, AE wants to see if the details that they, again, kind of guessed at based upon knowledge are correct. Is the distress caused by corrosion as shown in that lower right-hand picture? Or could it be detailing from the original architectural detailing that you may want to modify? Again, it may not involve modifying the unit cost. It's just kind of reallocating things, making sure that contractor AE are on the same page and making sure that you get the right repair installed in a timely process. Also during the documentation, upper right-hand corner, you want to review other conditions, make sure that distress conditions that may not have been visible from the outside, either from the visual or even up close inspections, get addressed. So upper right-hand picture, again, piece of terracotta cracked, couldn't see it from the outside, may not be able to detect it through sounding, but you see it once you open up and you can tell the contractor, hey, we want to remove this piece as well. So critical for AE to be involved and on the scaffold and in the field a lot of times with the contractor. If you run into a one-off condition, again, timeliness response, you're out there, the AE's out there on site, contractor opens something up, one-off condition, you say, okay, I'll get you detail, but perhaps you can use the same number of anchors, same type of anchors that the contractor already has. It might fit in within the unit cost, or if it doesn't, you prepare a change order and get that into the owner in a timely fashion so they can keep on track with what's going on and how the process is going. Then there's observing, making sure your repairs are performed correctly. Everything's getting installed as needed, substrate's getting prepared. Right before they're ready to put a new piece back in, it looks good, and AE is happy with the design and the prep work. Then there's final inspections and closeout. Earlier on, you complete an inspection for a type of material, and the AE inspects it. If there's modifications to do, if something didn't look right at the end, you can communicate with the contractor and say, next time when you install this, let's tweak this a little bit, or let's pull this out a little bit and modify and tweak this final appearance so that we're happy at the end of the day, and you're not waiting to the middle of the project to tweak those. You're able to get that done right away to make sure that the actual final repair is appropriate for the initial intent and what the owner is looking for. Why was this approach successful for this job? Again, kind of summarize, the owner needed to get on the building as soon as possible and start construction. So going into a traditional design, build phase would have taken months. unknowns, whether or not you do the traditional design and bid phase, or if you allow the AE to get on the building and kind of do a design repair with a contractor. There's always going to be unknowns that need to be modified and tweaked. So the earlier you can get on, the earlier you can get that process going. It helps simplify the payment process. The unit costs fit for a lot of different situations, again, based upon a quantity of stone. So one unit cost based upon a cubic foot worked for a variety of conditions on the building and made payment application easier to understand and push through. It also allowed for quick modifications, any changes for unforeseen conditions, because we were always involved with the contractor on doing a bunch of drops from the initial to openings to final installation. Any modifications that need to be done were picked up quickly. Details could be made if need be, supplemental details sent over to the contractor so that it didn't stop them from work on any one drop, able to complete the work and move on to the next. I will pass it over to Rachel now. She will go through case studies 2 and 3.
So this subject building is an 1890s building that's clad in terracotta with brick on the alley facade and granite at the base. So again, the project approach here was sort of a pre-purchase assessment, looking at that from grade with binoculars. The follow-up based on that initial pre-purchase was performing a limited close-up assessment, and by limited I mean 2 swing stage drops, so pretty limited in terms of what information was able to be gained from that, and then moving into that exterior envelope repairs. So looking at each of those steps in a little bit more detail and looking at it relative to the approach that we've been discussing. So that project definition included that prioritized repair recommendations and estimate of probable cost, which happened during the due diligence phase. In between that time, we were able to get up to 2 drop locations and start to develop some scope documents, which ultimately were bid to masonry contractors, and then starting construction with the understanding that supplemental investigation and supplemental details were required throughout that process. So here's just a look at the quick sort of overall investigation that happens as part of that pre-purchase, how it gets documented, as Matt mentioned, and then really trying to get some of the information when we do have that limited assessment. What are the types of information we're looking for? How are we going to be able to develop scope documents? So as we mentioned earlier, reviewing original documents or anything that is provided to us is really helpful, especially in the scope document phase. So on the left here, we have an original construction detail from this building, and then ultimately showing the scope document repair detail that was prepared. The thing to note about this is that oftentimes the detailing itself is not changing significantly. We're thinking about the detailing from the standpoint of how can this unit be installed in a situation where it's selective replacement, meaning that the building's not being built from ground up like it was historically or in the original documents. So understanding how units and how the masonry is supported and how that needs to be addressed in terms of the repairs. And really that's what the scope documents are utilized for in terms of getting costs for those repairs. So some of the things that oftentimes are part of the supplemental investigation may be cleaning on a masonry facade. This is oftentimes included in the scope documents with a best guess or a placeholder in terms of what system may or may not work. Oftentimes we have to get up and do trials and understand what system's going to work best and be gentle enough to not cause damage to the building. So for example, on this building, it had to be cleaned twice, meaning that the black soiling was removed with the initial cleaning, and then there was an orange soiling under the black soiling, which is something we could have never known until we started to do the supplemental investigation and trials. One of the other aspects of supplemental investigation that is incredibly important is understanding its concealed conditions. What's going on behind the face of the masonry, and how is that related to the distress that we're seeing? And so here you sort of see the building taken apart, understanding how it's moving, and then also in the center image, showing that repairs had been done previously, but not necessarily understanding the cause of distress and that those were needing to be repaired again. So one of the aspects that we talked about a lot is the supplemental repairs and the detailing, and how does that work relative to the scope documents. So here's on the left are images of the as-built condition. On the right is the scope document repair for this specific instance. And as you'll note, the anchors that are shown on the drawings are not exactly the anchors that are shown in the scope documents, but that's exactly what was intended, that there is an intent for anchorage, and a lot of these things oftentimes have to be reacted to and changed in the field. While it's relatively simple here, there are other instances where things need to adjust for the actual field conditions. Supplemental repairs also involved dealing with additional stress on this building, very typical on full terracotta clad facade buildings. But the thing that is most important to note about this is that they all behave differently. And so they're incredibly unpredictable. And understanding that this oftentimes may be something that you have to stop, readjust, and deal with what the building's telling you. And so for this specific instance, work was being done in another portion of the building, the stress was redistributing, and joints, soft joints were needed to be cut, which were never part of the original plan. While this is not masonry, oftentimes many of these rehab buildings require other scopes of work that are going to happen in the same location. So windows, whether it be window replacement, whether it be window restoration, as well as roofing replacement oftentimes comes into play as well. So why was this approach successful for this building? Here, it was an iterative and collaborative process with the team, which allowed for continued communication. The integration of the masonry restoration with the window replacement and restoration and roofing replacement allowed for shared access. The window restoration contractors here actually used the swing stages that the masonry contractors were also using, which allowed for decreased costs because of a reduced schedule. Here, we were able to provide the most appropriate repair because we were reacting to field conditions, such as that stress relief that I talked about earlier. And because the scope documents established costs in the bidding, it allowed for a simplified approval process for additional repairs, for things such as the additional cleaning. So looking at one more case study, and you'll note that this has slightly a different approach. This building is a 19-teens building, also in Chicago. And here, it's clad with brick and terracotta and stone. So this project started with the City of Chicago critical facade examination using industrial rope access, meaning that it was pretty limited in terms of what could be done as part of that initial assessment. In 2016, a due diligence inspection was performed for a potential buyer. And what happened here was essentially getting close up to 3 of the 4 facades of this building, and then ultimately moving into an exterior envelope rehabilitation. So what does this chart look like? How does the masonry facade repair approach differ? Ultimately, here's that project definition that includes the due diligence and prioritized repairs. A general contractor was involved at that time and put together costs based on those prioritized repairs. Ultimately, scope docs were put together and requested an engineer's estimate of probable cost, and then moving into bidding and really understanding that value engineering was a step that was taken in this process, reallocating the repairs and understanding if there were changes that could be made ahead of time. One of the things that we really want to highlight on this case study was how this approach helped with the schedule of the terracotta manufacturing. And it's to note there were over 4,000 units of terracotta needed for this repair. So here's looking at that project development, the initial investigation, getting up close using ropes, as I mentioned. Not a whole lot you can do other than sounding or some visual no inspection openings, but just getting a closer up visual understanding of the building. Moving into the due diligence inspection, this was performed with swing stages, so there was an ability to get up close to more of the facade. But inspection openings were really limited to areas of distress, pieces of the building that could be taken off easily in hopes of understanding some of the as-built construction. Through that due diligence, that prioritized repair recommendations were developed, and ultimately a cost estimate put together by the general contractor. And just developing the scope documents with the information that was available. Here, there were no existing drawings, so it was making openings where possible or where the building had already made openings for us, and getting some documentation so we could put together a best guess for scope documents. So moving into construction, one of the first steps of the supplemental investigation was to perform a full survey relative to the terracotta units to understand which units were going to require replacement. And so as Matt mentioned, documentation was incredibly important through all of these projects, but this project we used Bluebeam. And so ultimately here's sort of the survey sheet that you see. There's a legend indicating the terracotta replacement. Looking up close to that, you sort of see how each one of those was documented, and then a photo given for each of those. So ultimately that information was shared across the entire team almost immediately between the architect, the engineer, the owner, the terracotta manufacturer. So it really made moving into the manufacturing process quite simple. As part of that documentation, we could indicate which needed replacement, but also based on that, the manufacturer could determine if there were units that they needed samples that needed to be shipped to them for developing their shop drawings. So the next step in that process was developing the shop drawings. Ultimately here you see a setting drawing which shows the information that was included on the documentation of replacement from the initial investigation moved into a shop document situation. So looking at that a little bit closer, giving each piece its own identification, and kind of seeing that from how it was moving through the manufacturing process. And this was something that required a lot of review from the entire team, and being able to look at that initial documentation and quickly evaluate that made this process move quite smoothly. And then moving forward into the actual piece documents or piece shop drawings, seeing how pictures could be shared, how the communication could be shared with the entire team very quickly, and moving that process of the documents from start to finish very quickly, and making a long lead time item, something like terracotta, as short as it could possibly be. So one of the other things to note on this building was there were multiple scopes of work going on at the same time, similar to case study 2. Window replacement and roofing replacement was going on. And so the multiple access. So you have swing stage access, mast climber access, pipe scaffolding access, as well as aerial lifts being used on this building. And so it was used by the multiple subcontractors, basically sharing the same space, but it also allowed for AE and owner communication to get up to each of these spaces very easily. So looking at during construction, as Matt mentioned previously, many of these specific instances are not necessarily shown in the scope documents, but there's something that we might need to tweak slightly based on a slight difference in the as-built construction. And so here's some of those instances of having a sense of what the intended repair is, how that differs if slightly different anchorages are required, and how that gets communicated. And a lot of this happens in the field or based on very quick communication with site visit reports and whatnot. So as with all of these, the final inspections and punch lists were very important, and easily communicating that to the entire team was also incredibly important. So again, utilizing that same sort of documentation procedure, The annotations are slightly different as they are not replacement terracotta, but just minor repairs that are needed to be completed with a system that the entire team was used to seeing throughout the entire project. So just showing photos and really making sure that everyone was on the same page. So again, why was this approach successful for this project? Documentation was key here. It was consistent throughout the project and usable by the entire team. The owner, the GC, there were actually 2 masonry restoration contractors on this team, the AE, as well as the terracotta manufacturer. One of the things that was done early on in this process was performing the assessments for that initial terracotta replacement with the masonry contractor, with the terracotta manufacturer, and with the AE. This helped us to maintain schedule, meaning that locations didn't need to be accessed twice. Timely response of the shop drawing and submittal inspections was very important. And then quickly developing any additional repair details allowed to maintain schedule, even with an increased scope. The integration of the masonry restoration with window replacement and restoration and roofing replacement performed concurrently, which was absolutely necessary to get this project done on schedule. And then establishing costs in the bidding, again, allowed for that simplified approval process for additional repairs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to wrap up all these 3 case studies and hopefully give you a sense of how to get started and what we've learned relative to this process.
Thank you, Rachel. To get us back to that chart that we showed earlier in the presentation, all these projects use the design repair approach, and so you can see here, even though we use all the same type of approach, each project was different, and the timeline for each project is different. There's a bunch of things that go into each project, and again, it depends upon the owner's needs, the type of building. If it's historic, there's going to be a historic aspect into it. You got to put time in to talk to local historical people, get things approved. There's going to be mock-ups and samples that they have to look at and approve. So it's not just an AE owner making a decision. It's a third entity as well. All the way to processing the cost for how you get the cost for the project, unit costs, small bid forms, large bid forms, phasing things out even after getting numbers back. Sometimes the owner has a certain a number in mind as far as budget, and is that something that can be accomplished in 20 years, or going to take 3 years, or is it something that you want to even spread out further, maybe address one side of the building every other year? Something that the owner and architect has to deal with. But again, the approach here of the design repair is to not have too much upfront information, or not, I don't want to say information, but have too much upfront time and kind of move more into construction as early as possible in order to get all the unknowns done and get the process going, pull pieces for terracotta replacement. Sometimes there's mixed trades, so you're going to have window subs on there to do work, and so you have to use scaffolding by 2 different companies if you want to coordinate that. Again, there's a lot to take in on this slide, but it shows just how every project is unique based upon owner and building needs. How does an owner get started, and how do they contact an AE? Well, again, the owner needs to have some idea of what they need. Are they just trying to fulfill a facade ordinance that might turn into something larger? That's one way, and a facade ordinance often do kind of highlight things for building owners that they need to address and hopefully give some kind of time frame. Or can work with the building owner after the facade ordinance is done to say, here's what we noticed and here's how we can help, or here's how we recommend you moving forward. Pre-purchase due diligences. Again, you have a building. Most owners want to maintain it so they're not hit with any large repair projects at one time that they have to tackle. So the more you can maintain a building and the more you can get on top of repairs early on, the better it is for the building. A lot of buildings in urban cities, Chicago, New York, are 50, 70, older than that. And so there's a routine maintenance that should be performed on those buildings. Is it a small repair project or a large facade rehabilitation? Is the owner looking for, hey, let's just address what's wrong and kind of keep it going and maintain the building? Or is it, we're going to move into a brand new building, we want to do a whole full-on facade rehabilitation and kind of tackle things now, knowing that we can't tackle everything and some things might move into a maintenance item, but hey, we're going to maintain this building as long as we own it down the road. Also, have an idea of budget, whether or not you're the owner or a property manager trying to get a talk to your owner, the owner of the building. Is there a certain budget? Sometimes if there's a known budget up front, the AE can kind of work around that and prioritize repairs, figure out what needs to be attacked first, what are the safety concerns, what needs to be addressed, what should be addressed on a drop-by-drop basis, because mobilization is often a huge cost. So maybe you just address things on facades or per drop basis and then schedule a time frame to keep moving down around the building. Do you have a time frame for you want to get everything done in 2 years, or you want to budget for a 10-year facade project? Is that possible? Again, owner working with the AE, getting that collaborative team going together from the get-go is very important. So nobody's taken aback by trying to accomplish something. And then are the tenant issues concerns? How big is this repair project going to be? Do you have sensitive tenants? Are you going to be into the tenant space? Are you doing window repairs, replacements, sidewalk canopies, things like that? Again, getting everybody on board ahead of schedule so you can notify your tenants. Everybody's aware, makes the project go a lot smoother in our experience. So lessons learned. I think we've talked a lot about all of these projects being very collaborative. In our experience, we find out the more open everybody is, the more everybody keeps touch during the project, the owner, the AE, the contractor. The contractor calls AE if they run into something, if they're not sure about something, rather than just trying to hide it or cover it up or move along because they need to. The AE being able to get on site and look at things, observe things, contact the owner right away, say, here's where we are, here's where the costs are as we're moving around the building. It makes the project go a whole lot easier and smoother and hopefully a happy ending for everybody. Sharing documentation. Again, as soon as you get information to everybody, the quicker things move, the easier and smoother things happen. Saving times. These design repair projects, again, like we say, often save time because it's not a lot of upfront inspection. You're not getting on the building twice. The AE is not getting on to document 100% of the building. So the owner has to pay for mobilization to do that, and then you're just mobilizing again in order to do construction. We realize that's not ideal for every project. There's certain projects, especially universities and or maybe government buildings, they need to have the I's dotted and T's crossed before they go into construction. But again, there are a lot of times where this is useful from small buildings to large projects. It allows for reallocation of budget money. Again, if you kind of have a unit cost, an overall budget that the AE and architect and even contractor might be even on board with or have knowledge of, you may do less repair in one item, but do more repair somewhere else because you've encountered once you get on the building it needs it, and something else you can kind of back off the quantity. It allows reacting to field conditions quickly, AE being out a lot on the building. Again, we find in our work, construction period services are really helpful for an AE. Everybody can guess how it's designed, look at drawings, but things are different in the field. Nothing's ever installed exactly the way that it is shown or anticipated. There's always something that pops up, and you may have to move it easy as moving an anchor from the side to the top, or sometimes having to redesign something in the field quickly, but working with the contractor to do it and get the project going and on time. An understanding of the masonry facades and how things work. As Rachel said, good AE firms and contractors can help the owner move through projects quickly and efficiently by saying, we kind of have an idea of how the system works. We have an idea of how the distress, what causes the distress, and we can kind of jump in and repair quickly and move on. So that's kind of a list of the lessons learned. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I think we are now going to move into the question and answer session.
Yes.
So please, I'll give it back to Liz for a second.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Rachel. As a reminder, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box and hit submit. We have a lot of good questions coming in. We'll take as many as we can before the end of the hour. But if we don't get to your question during the call, rest assured that we will follow up with you afterward. All right, let's take our first question. Have you had experience where repairs are not possible or just not cost justified?
Yes, that's something that we deal with all the time. It's really talking about that prioritization where repairs, oftentimes there's a certain cost that's associated with them, and it's kind of really understanding what that time frame is. Are you looking to address the distress that you see currently? Are you looking for a project that's long-term maintenance? Are you looking to be preventative? So there's definitely times where maybe that cost isn't justified, especially too thinking about who ownership is. What's the long-term hold on this building? In some of these instances, we've worked on projects where you do a pre-purchase and the owner only intends to hold the building for 5 years. So there's certain costs that relative to masonry facade repairs that may not be justified for that specific owner.
And sometimes you get involved in a building where you're doing like a pick and clean or something minor, and you are involved, or you find something more imminent, more hazardous, and sometimes it's just you have to stabilize it and kind of come back to a later time. Again, letting the owner know that. Perhaps the owner has some money that they can pull aside and take care of it while they're there, but sometimes you can only spend so much money because that's all they have, but you need to stabilize things and make sure the building is safe before you pull off.
Okay, our next question. How do you recommend budgeting for unforeseen conditions? Is there a reasonable standard for contingency?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends a lot on the building type. As you are doing facade repairs as an AE, you kind of learn an idea of the type of distress, kind of conditions that you might run into based upon what the building is, how it's constructed, how large the project is. There's usually a percentage for contingency, and it's discussed early on with the owner. There's probably a larger, in my experience, larger contingency for such materials like terracotta. One, it's a big time frame to get terracotta. It takes now between 9 months, if you're lucky, or more than a year typically is what we try to tell owners before you can get terracotta made. So sometimes you want to spend more and get a couple extra pieces in case you find an unforeseen condition at a typical location on the building. And so that's just, again, knowledge of the material type, distress type, and working with the owner is kind of how you can come up with a contingency.
One thing along those lines, too, is really having that scope documents, understanding that the scope may shift. So sometimes repairs that may not be as necessary in the early stage become the contingency for repairs that are needed more immediately. As Matt said, the terracotta contingency is probably higher than most other masonry materials, and 20% is not unheard of in those instances. Sometimes I think people think that's a little bit crazy, but it's pretty typical as 20% or more.
Okay, our next question. In general, in regards to work performance, is it best to execute exterior facade repair work from the top of the building to the base of the building, or vice versa?
I don't think it necessarily determines if it's top or from the base. Ultimately, looking at if there's other conditions that you need to address. If there's roofing conditions that need to be addressed at the same time, understanding if there are potential water leakage issues, thinking about the building sort of in drops if possible, getting and finishing an entire location. Typically, I would say we clean in a specific order. We clean, but beyond that, and it's not necessarily saying it needs to be from the top or the bottom starting.
Typically, repairs will be done vertically, though, because of access. So you're usually accessing a building vertically with pipes, with suspended scaffold is typically the typical access. Sometimes you do piping, so you're all over the building, but usually it's vertical, so it's more that way than top to bottom. There are certain things as terracotta You might want to open up certain locations to make sure that you don't have any stress within the wall to have those hidden conditions that Rachel talked about with the stress and the shearing of units. But other than that, it's based upon need.
Okay, next question. Do you use drones to conduct condition assessments?
We definitely have. It's a good first step. It's a tool like anything else. So as we mentioned, that visual assessment, it is exactly that. It's a visual assessment. So if there's something that we need to get up close to where we might need to do some sounding or other non-destructive testing, a drone won't do that for us. But it certainly is a good first step. It's an inexpensive way to see the building close up.
Okay, next question. How do you determine the best contractor to do the work on a particular project? Is it a past relationship with a contractor? And what do you do in an area where you don't have any experience with the contractors? Do you use any contractor certification?
So in this type of, facade rehabilitation, I think we do have a tight-knit group of contractors that we work with. It's something, it's different than new construction. It's a different type of animal. We do have throughout our company, I think, contractors that we work with a lot. We talk throughout the company, different offices, so different locations. We have people who do different types of work, whether it's masonry or roofing or concrete. So we have the ability to structural. We have the ability to talk to those different people in those different groups to find out good contractors that they have worked with in the past. And so that's typically, I think, how our work goes. We will inevitably, work with contractors that clients ask us to work with. Sometimes that will involve more CPS on our part because we have to kind of make sure that that contractor is installing things the way that we want. That's typically how we will bid out projects and approach repairs.
The other thing relative to specifically masonry contractors, there are some certifications like the Historic Preservation Certification that is put out there by the International Masonry Institute, which is a good sense if it's a contractor that you don't necessarily have a relationship with or haven't worked with in the past. It's done by IMI. So it's one of the things to think about that could be written into your spec if you're trying to get a base level of understanding, especially for these older masonry buildings.
Okay, another question. When assigning unit costs to certain types or repairs, is it important for the owner and contractor to clarify the quantity range for each unit cost? For example, the unit cost for a repair will be much higher if there's only one of them versus 100 of them. Unit prices should vary with quantity range, correct?
Absolutely. Especially if we're working in that vertical location that Matt was saying, if you're doing it on a swing stage, thinking about if there's two guys on a swing stage and there's only one location, that repair cost is now doubled. So it's really sort of trying to be as open and honest as you can relative to those quantities that not just beefing up the quantities to make sure that you have something in the scope, whereas it might not be the opportunity to regain that later.
Okay, wouldn't a building's historic nature be a consideration, say if it's on the National Historic Register?
Yeah, for sure. That's kind of what I talked about in the slide of timeline. You have to, if it's a historic building, you're going to have to add a little bit more time in the process. There are local historic entities that you have to integrate into the project, so it's not just the owner architect. It's now the owner architect and a historical entity that has to look at and approve colors, materials, things like that. And one of these jobs, one of the things that was nice is we kind of, we work throughout the country, and a lot of our offices know what the local landmark people are going to want, or historical people are going to want. So we are able to anticipate that sometimes and help the process and move it along.
Okay, we will take our next question. Where do inspection requirements for existing masonry come from? Is there a manual for this, for example?
So one of the things that we highlighted, I mean, is sort of why we get involved, right? Why does an AE get involved? Oftentimes are the inspection requirements. They vary throughout. If it's a very specific defined inspection, like the facade ordinance, those are defined by the cities that have those ordinances, and a lot of that is available on facadeordinance.com. Just for a quick primer on those. There are other guides out there for how to do a condition assessment of a masonry facade, but I would say there's no hard and fast rules on what the actual inspection requirements are, other than specific facade ordinances.
Okay, next question. How do you handle dangerous conditions that are seen during the survey?
Well, the first thing is to notify the owner right away. If we're on the wall and we get to it and it's a fall hazard, we have to address it right away, whether it's removing it or having a contractor stabilize it, pin it, net it. We always want to take care of hazardous conditions because public safety is number one. But always letting the owner know and finding out how they want to address it. If they want to leave the temporary stabilization in place, and then we have to give a time frame for that, or do they want to, address that condition right then and there?
Okay, next question. Is visual inspection sufficient in determining whether masonry units can be reused? Are there other factors such as age of unit, etc., trying to make the repair match existing? So is visual inspection sufficient in determining whether masonry units can be reused?
Not always. Again, there are hidden conditions. Units can be cracked from within the wall, whether it's brick or terracotta or even limestone. Spalls within the unit that you can't see visually. We try to salvage as much as possible and reuse for multiple purposes. One, cost usually, but two, if we're dealing with historic, you want to salvage and maintain as much historic fabric as possible. If it's not a historic building, sometimes salvaging and replacing brick, let's say, is cost prohibitive or not worth it, because buying cheap brick or brick that's fairly cheap as far as cost is concerned to replace existing brick might be more economical for a contractor rather than having somebody clean off the mortar. But again, we try to salvage as much as possible, but it's not always possible and it's not always known based upon a visual inspection.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Okay. How are modifications to the scope of work addressed with most contracts? Is it time and materials, and are the rates established before the work begins or a negotiated price change?
So I would say a lot of that is basically based on those unit costs or the established costs that are in the bid, which ultimately the bid form that is developed by or filled out by a masonry contractor and developed by the AE becomes an exhibit to the contract. So some of this stuff is done where there's maybe not an official change order completed, meaning that some of those repairs might be traded amongst different line items. But oftentimes, if an official change order is needed to address the contract of value, the prices or unit prices that were established as part of the bidding documents become the basis for that cost change.
Yeah, in that regard, it's even if you go through a full document set and have standard costs instead on itemized costs, it's always good to have unit costs for things that, again, you think might come up and might be able covered under that tuck pointing, sealant work, things like that, in order to have something as a basis. So when you get into an unknown, you can say, well, your unit cost for this was X, and your unit cost for that was Y. This repair has both of those, so let's get a price that falls in within those two unit items.
Okay, thank you, Matt and Rachel. That is all the time that we have for questions today. Just a reminder that Matt and Rachel will be following up with anyone who asked a question who we didn't have a chance to get to within the hour. We would I'd really like to thank you all for joining us. We hope it's been educational. You will receive an email this afternoon with a link to an on-demand version of this webinar, and that email will also include a link for you to download your certificate of participation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at lpimper@wja.com in the meantime. And thank you again for your time. We hope you have a great rest of the day.